Egypt is the gift of the Nile. These are the words usually attributed to Herodotus, the man who is often called the father of history. In truth, it is rather an oversimplification of what he actually wrote. The full statement appears to indicate that he regarded the fertile lands along the Nile to be the river's gift. And if so, then it is true, for the entirety of Egyptian civilization owes everything it became to the river which flows in its land, and geography played a major role in its evolution. Because the river overflowed its banks annually, thus depositing new layers of silt, the land surrounding the Nile was extremely fertile, and so the fundamental opposition of Egypt is created. On one hand, the red land of sand and rock, burned by the heating sun, Deshret, and in another, the black land around the river which is fertile, Kemet. Between the north of Egypt, the delta, where the Nile Valley is quite large, and the south, where a narrow corridor of arable land forms around the Nile, its only link is the river and its fertilizing floods. Thus, Egypt is the gift of the Nile, as Herodotus supposedly puts it. In this land, where the desert heat is a fact of life, and where from around 2400 BCE all the way to today, there's very little precipitation. Sharing the same latitude as the Sahara and the Negev, had the Nile not existed, Egypt would have been the same as them, a mere desert. But the river, with its periodic and highly predictable flooding, saves this land from sharing the same fate. The phenomenon known as flooding, particularly that of the Nile, is rather complex. The spring rain of the monsoon which falls under Ethiopia determines how high the Nile will rise. From July to October, the water will cover the valley. However, this flood could also lead to disaster. If the flood is too big, then the river will simply take away whatever it can. If it's too weak, it will not cover enough of the arable land. Thus, one can say Egyptian civilization was born when the flood became controlled. The means which they did so were complex and used progressively. First, the Egyptians created levees of protection all across the Nile. Then, from a canal network and retention deposits, they learned, little by little, to control the flood. Finally, with an intelligent and careful use of the land's valley, the canal network would allow the water to reach lands the flood wouldn't have been able to on its own. Thus, the Nile and its flood may have been a natural phenomenon, but Egypt is in fact a human creation. It should be noted, however, while the flooding of the Nile was much more predictable and calm than other rivers, such as the Tigris or the Euphrates, it was not always perfect, as high floods were potentially destructive and weak floods could lead to famine, a much worse problem than the former. However, the Egyptians still took this issue into consideration, as the second mean in which the Egyptians utilized to cover the flaws of the Nile was in the creation of a reserve, accumulated in the good harvesting years, whenever the flood was too shallow. The royal treasury of Egypt was essentially a granary, and a good administration must ensure the granary is always well stocked. Such a necessity certainly contributed towards establishing a highly authoritarian and centralized political regime. It demanded early on the installation of a highly effective administration, which would allow the populace to live and prosper, regardless of how good or bad the yearly flood was. However, Egypt's geographic nature is naturally inclined to create a politically fractured power, as its land is 35 times longer than large. Wherever the administrative center would be, it will always be far apart from certain provinces. As such, it's extremely difficult to determine the capital of the kingdom. And so, Egypt's history is to go back and forth between two naturally opposing tendencies. Either the land is ruled by a highly centralized absolute power, or such power is dispersed along its many different communities. The periods where power is concentrated are considered the Golden Ages of Egypt, called the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom, whereas the periods where power is fractured are called the Intermediate Periods, of which there are 3. Despite this strip of land around the Nile being rather narrow, it was extremely rich in natural resources. At the time, the gallery forest was quite dense in Upper Egypt, where monkeys, elephants, leopards, cobras, and serpents roamed free. The savanna and the desert were rich in herbivorous creatures, such as rabbits, hedgehogs, gazelles, antelope, and giraffes, as well as many predators, such as lions, lynxes, hyenas, wild dogs, foxes, eagles, and falcons, as well as some fearsome creatures, like the scorpion or the viper. In the river margins, one would find hippopotamuses, crocodiles, otters, large lizards like the varanus, as well as boars, mongooses, and gennets. Numerous birds live throughout the Nile: ducks, geese, pelicans, flamingos, and more. The waters of the river contain numerous species of fish, and river turtles weren't rare. The flora wasn't quite as rich. Varied grassland from the savanna and the margins of the river, and several species of trees ranging from the Nile cataract to the Mediterranean coast. The swamps contained numerous aquatic plants, such as potageton, blue and pink lotus, and more. But above all else in importance, the papyrus, which would be used for multiple innovations, such as rope, sandals, boats, and of course, writing. The wealth of the fauna will diminish starting from the pre-dynastic and especially from around 2500 BCE onwards. This impoverishment of the land will be due to human hands, from the exploitation of the Nile Valley by its farmers, as the construction of dikes throughout the river will destroy the forest, the leveling of the soil will destroy the swamps, and hunting will reduce the number of animals. By around 2400 BCE, the savanna will have been turned into a desert, and this reduces the amount of resources acquired from hunting, as well as the possibility of the creation of livestock. However, starting from the Neolithic, and maybe even before, be it from imports or by self-selection, the Egyptians modified the resources of wild nature. Barley and spelt substitute the primitive grasses. Lentils, beans, garlic, cucumber, onions, and leek take the place of the plants which covered the now disappeared gallery forest. And if any attempt to domesticate wild animals such as the gazelle or the hyena failed, they succeed with the cow, the goat, the ram, and the pig. This transformation was progressive. Up until 2200 BCE, due to a relatively stronger humidity, livestock plays an important role, more or less the same as that of agriculture. However, starting from the Middle Kingdom, agriculture becomes dominant, and the kingdom begins relying on imports to fulfill its needs when it comes to livestock. Due to its geographic nature, Egypt found itself between Asia and the rest of Africa, and as such, was always a place of international occurrences, both peaceful and violent. The Nile Valley provides a privileged position between the Mediterranean world and East Africa. By the Isthmus of the Suez, it is in contact with the Syro-Palestinian corridor, and by extension, with Mesopotamia and Anatolia. These ties, long established since the Neolithic, have their mark even in the language and the writing. If morphology and syntax are at times close to Semitic, The hieroglyphic signals are, in contrast, more akin to representing the fauna and flora of Africa. To Asia, Egypt would acquire its wood for construction, as the trees of the Nile Valley were difficult to work with. Copper came, for the most part, from the Sinai, as well as the turquoise. From these imports, one would add lapis lazuli from Asia, and from the Middle East, livestock and numerous fabricated products. From Africa came ebony, ivory, and obsidian, as well as a bit of copper during the Old Kingdom, and mainly, especially from the Middle Kingdom onwards, gold, cattle, exotic goods, and, be it for or against one's own will, human hands for work. Through the Mediterranean, Egypt has been in contact with the Aegean world, which, even since the Middle Kingdom, would provide numerous goods, be it Cypriot copper, Cilician silver, and Syrian ivory. In the Red Sea, Egyptian sailors would navigate to the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb to obtain from the African coast incense, spices, ebony, ivory, gold, animals such as baboons, or leopard skin. From the west, Egypt had relations with the Libyans, which populated the lands in the coast of the Mediterranean, and the oases located nearby the Nile, from Siwa in the north to Kargeh in the south. Though little in numbers, Libyan products, such as smaller livestock, olive oil, and wine, were highly appreciated by the Egyptians. In the pre-dynastic period and throughout the first half of the Old Kingdom, these goods fulfilled an important economic as well as religious role. The geographic nature where the Egyptian civilization developed ended up greatly marking the daily lives of its inhabitants. The productive flood imposed a rigorous rhythm on the Egyptians' lives. After the water receded from the fields, between October and December, the farmers had to sow the fields, often still wet, if not outright muddy. Once sowed, the seed would not again be watered, be it naturally or artificially, until the complete maturation of the plant. It would instead take advantage of the humidity retained in the soil. While waiting for the reap, which would begin in March, the farmers would take care of the vegetable gardens and orchards planted by the margins of the river, or in the canals, which was easy to water via the use of buckets, and later, through storks. Beginning from early June at the latest, the reap took place and the grain stored in the granaries. Thus, it would be necessary from May to July to prepare for the new flood. The Egyptians would repair any damaged structure, clean up the dirtied canals, and properly level the soil once again. It was for this type of work, which would be only effective if it was finished on time and in a proper way, that a central authority was indispensable. Starting from July, the flood would begin again. From July to October, Egypt would be covered by the Nile's water, and the villages of the valley would communicate with each other through the dikes, which also acted as makeshift roads. The farmer would then stop working the fields, but it was still not a period of rest for him. Taking advantage of the flood, the central authority would utilize the Nile to convey orders from one extremity of the kingdom to the other. The administration would order the transportation of construction materials, most notably stone and wood, which would be used for construction works, most specifically temples and royal tombs. This work demanded long and numerous projects. The flood was also the period in which military and commercial campaigns tended to take place, as travel was easier along a flooded Nile. Thus, the rhythm of Egyptian life is established. From the end of July to the middle of November, the valley is flooded. It is the season of transportation and expeditions. From the middle of November to the middle of March, it is the seeding season. And from the middle of March to the middle of July, to reap and prepare for the new flood. It is through agriculture that the Egyptian calendar forms. As the year is divided accordingly, through the three different phases: Achet, the period of the floods; Beret, the period of plant growth; and Shemu, the period of reaping. These three 4-month seasons represent the scheme of the agricultural works previously described. Each month has 30 days, meaning the calendar has a total of 360 days. The first day of the year coincided with the first day of the first month of Achet. The Egyptians determined this day in a rather primitive manner, namely, directly observing the rise of the Nile water. This meant the first day of the year varied, and the last month of the Shemu would sometimes be longer and sometimes shorter. However, eventually, perhaps by the 3rd dynasty, they eventually linked the natural phenomena of the flood to an astronomical phenomena: the appearance of the star Sepideh, modern-day Sirius, by sunset. It is called the heliacal rising of Sothis. This phenomena, under the latitude of the ancient city of Memphis, royal capital of Egypt, occurs on the 14th of June under the Gregorian calendar, and it is effectively around this time that the flood slowly begins. From that point onwards, the year officially began on the day of the heliacal rising of Sothis, and would last for 365 days, because the Egyptians observed that was the amount of time it took for the phenomena to repeat itself, meaning they added another 5 days to the calendar. If the heliacal rising of Sothis had been observed every year, the Egyptians would have found the perfect calendar. However, that is not quite what happened. In the newly adopted calendar, and without a doubt starting from the 3rd millennium BCE, depending on whichever chronology is correct, the first day of the year would come exactly 365 days later. And given a real solar year is roughly 365 days and 6 hours, the calendar would continuously drift off the accurate solar year as time passed. After 120 years, there would be a full month of difference between the two, and only after 1,460 years would the two coincide again. This is what is referred to as a Sothic cycle. The difference between the astronomical year and the Egyptian year could have provided Egyptologists a fairly secure chronology. However, establishing an exact date has caused much debate. Through the Sothic cycle, it would theoretically be possible to discover when exactly this Egyptian calendar took place. Though the date of 4241 BCE has been proposed, most recent scholars have rejected this date, either moving the date to the next cycle, which would be 2781 BCE, or reject the assumption in which the original date was based on, as it included a text which states the heliacal rising of Sirius took place in 139 BCE, one which is not wholly reliable. The civil calendar, however, never substituted the lunar calendar, long established since the Proto-dynastic, which the Egyptians used daily. It was always the phases of the moon which determined the great religious festivals. Even after the adoption of the civil calendar, the Egyptians remained using an improved version of the lunar calendar, and in this regard, when referring to the Egyptian calendar, one must refer to not the one, but the two. Starting from the 3rd millennium BCE, the Egyptian civilization appears to be already constituted, as it would remain for 3 millennia. The period of formation from this civilization in all its aspects, be it the writing, language, religion, institution, and art, is extremely important, but unfortunately, highly obscure. The information, extracted from both archaeological works as well as texts, only gives us a general outline of the events. The history of the origins of Egypt can be divided in 3 epochs: the end of the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic, which ranges from 45,000 BCE to 5000 BCE, the Neolithic, ranging from 5000 BCE to around 3800 BCE, and the Pre-dynastic era, from around 3800 BCE to around 3000 BCE. The Nile Valley went through several Paleolithic phases. Egypt has been inhabited by humans for at least 2 million years, though the evidence for such is sparse and fragmentary. The oldest archaeological finds in Egypt, stone tools belonging to the Oldowan industry, are poorly dated. These were succeeded by the Achillean, dating back some 300 to 400,000 years ago. Further, several industries were discovered, including the Silcilian, Fakurian, Aphian, Kubanian, Itfuan, Shuikathian, and Isnan. And as the Paleolithic reaches its end, so would Assyrian tool use, as well as the Hormuzan industry. It is in the existence of a wetter climate which facilitates life along the southern Nile, where the savanna reigns supreme, and both wild animals and edible plants are aplenty. The savanna itself is the domain of the Assyrian populations, whereas the Hormuzan are closer to the river, where they largely practice fishing and hunting. Both populations appear to have been more or less contemporary. The late Paleolithic is equally known in Egypt, in its ancient forms, the Assyrian and the Hormuzan, and the High Valley. But it is where we see a notable development. The technique used in stone cutting, to that point the same as in Europe, begins to individualize in Africa, and series of Sabellian were discovered in Kom Ombo in Upper Egypt. The Mesolithic proves to be an important period of transition between the late Paleolithic and the Neolithic. It would seem the agriculture which had developed during this period did not survive the drier climate of the 12th and 11th millennia BCE. Thus, the populations of the Mesolithic reverted back to hunting, fishing, and harvesting from local plants. The men from both the Paleolithic as well as the Mesolithic in Egypt were known for its lithic industry. They produced daggers of chipped stone, cleavers, scrapers, awls, and gravers. These utensils were rather notable for the exceptional quality of Egyptian flint, which is abundant nearby Libya. These rare vestiges of camps found were dated to the end of the late Paleolithic and the Mesolithic. They show that their occupants would feed on mostly mollusks, fish, and whatever they could hunt, and the presence of millstones proves that if they did not cultivate, which wasn't an impossibility, they would at least harvest from the grasses, particularly barley. Finally, they knew of the bow, for a large number of arrowheads have been discovered. It is in the 6th millennium BCE that the Neolithic period begins in the Nile Valley. With it comes the manifestation of old techniques associated with the period, including in stone polishing, in weaving, of an abundant degree of pottery, of considerable agricultural fields, and the domestication of animals. However, there are no vestiges of the Egyptians using copper at this point. In Lower Egypt, the men of Fayum A and Merimda cultures dedicate a large portion of their activities to agriculture and the creation of livestock. The discovery of sites, prepared with wicker baskets buried underground, which still contained grain, allowed archaeologists to determine these men already knew of wheat, barley, buckwheat, and flax, which denotes an agricultural experience prior to the early stages of the Neolithic. The bones of animals, such as bulls, goats, rams, and dogs, found on these sites prove that the creation of livestock was largely practiced. Remains of ceramics, and even pieces of clothing, testify the knowledge of pottery and weaving. Already farmers The village inhabitants continued to practice fishing and hunting, as numerous flint arrowheads were also discovered. The villages were constituted by circular or oval huts, at times partially digged on the ground. The dead were buried as if they still belonged to the group. Grain placed on the head perhaps point to the general belief of a life after death. In Upper Egypt, the Neolithic is known to the Nakata and Badarian cultures. It would seem the Badarian culture differs from Fayum A in regards to burial, as they did not bury the dead in villages but in necropolis nearby the desert. At times, the body rests covered by animal skin and surrounded by objects which he may need in the afterlife. And so, not only there is a belief in the afterlife, but also funerary rites. This evolution would eventually take place in the north, particularly in El Omari culture, nearby modern-day Cairo, as well as in Merimda culture. In certain points, the El Omari culture appears to have had more advanced techniques than its southern counterparts. The stone instruments are better worked, the arrowheads in flint particularly notable. They initiate the production of stone vases, a typical industry of pharaonic Egypt that is still ignored in the south. Finally, construction seemed to be more grouped in the north, whereas in Upper Egypt they are more dispersed. The south, however, has an advantage in pottery. Even if the north has more varied forms, the technique used in the south is simply superior. Though the pre-dynastic period may often be called the Neolithic or the Chalcolithic, it can't be deduced that the introduction of metal was, in Egypt, a very important revolution. There is, in fact, no rupture between the Neolithic and Neolithic, and it is necessary to highlight, on the contrary, the continuity of the evolution of the human societies from one stage to the other. It's for this reason both expressions were abandoned to simply refer to this period as the pre-dynastic. Just as in the previous epoch, we found in Egypt two cultural groups, one in the north and another in the south. Both evolved separately, despite contacts with each other, up until the middle of the pre-dynastic, where they began fusing into a single civilization, of which Egypt will be born. Though metal is known, the utensils being used continue to be made of flint. Copper, which is at this point rare, is simply hammered. Metal in general is increasingly used as time progresses, but it would not be until around 3500 BCE where its use becomes truly common. It is in a culture, the Amratian, that the bridge between two separate cultures become one is formed, as this culture continues where the Badarian picked off. In Amratian sites, obsidian objects were discovered. This volcanic, natural glass does not exist in Egypt. Thus, its presence heavily implies trading relations, particularly with lands further south. After a few centuries or so, Amratian begins fusing with the culture of Lower Egypt, the Gerzean culture. This process is very gradual, however, and differences between both cultures can be found, particularly in pottery. From this point onwards, we finally find something which hadn't been possible so far, namely, names of kings. The Palermo stone is a surviving fragment of a stela known as the Royal Annals of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, and it gives us some indications to this period, as it has conserved the names of 7 sovereign rulers over Lower Egypt and 5 rulers of Upper Egypt, which, presumably, must have ruled during this period. But unfortunately, they're only names. If the Palermo stone demonstrates Egypt is still politically divided into two, both kingdoms appear to be of the same civilization. On both sides, the god Horus is worshipped, and both the kings of the north and the south call themselves his faithful servant. It is difficult to determine the date in which both the southern and northern cultures completely unify into one. But then again, any date to determine any of the events that we'll have transcribed from now on will be extremely difficult. Ancient historian Mark van den Murup has asserted most historians today would consider that it isn't possible to put forward exact dates earlier than the 8th century BCE, and as such, not willing to risk the possibility of deceiving the audience, even if by accident, we will not even try. By extension, it is also extremely difficult to determine when exactly did the struggle between North and South finally came to an end. The victory of the South is only known through a few monuments impossible to date with such precision. These monuments are pallets and mace heads discovered in the primitive temple of Hierakonpolis, Hagen in Egyptian. Among these monuments, the most important is a ceremonial pallet, which depicts a king using the crown of the South, occupied in a rite of foundation. In the top register, there is a row of gnome standards, with a bird dangling from each of them, strung up by its neck, believed to symbolize a class of the Egyptian population. It is deduced that this monument, called the Scorpion Macehead, represents the king defeating its Egyptian enemies. The victory of this Scorpion King over the northern Egyptians is confirmed by another monument, a pallet in which a king called Narmer, using on one side the southern crown and the other the north, is depicted punishing the enemies in the north and examining their decapitated corpses. From the Scorpion Macehead and the Narmer pallet, it would seem easy to construct a narrative of the historical events. The second to last king of the South would have been the Scorpion. It would have been him to initiate the conquest of the north, which would then be concluded by his successor, King Narmer. In the sequence of that conquest, Narmer would have placed upon his head the crowns of both the north and the south. It is entirely possible, however, that this sequence is, in fact, too simple. Another fragment represents a king having upon his head the crown of the north. If this king is in fact a scorpion, the conquest of Lower Egypt can't have been the sole feat of Narmer, as the victory of the south would not have been obtained simply once. It would have been, instead, the product of multiple campaigns. Thus, it isn't possible to have a precise date for the end of the pre-dynastic era, as such an event may have been in reality a very long process across several generations. The sheer speed of Egypt's evolution starting from the middle of the pre-dynastic has incited certain historians to attribute the birth of Egyptian civilization to odd contributions in the Nile Valley. According to these, Neolithic culture would have originated from Asia, most notably Mesopotamia. This theory is based on 4 observations. First, in the Gerzean necropolis, skeletal remains indicate the presence of 2 different races. Secondly, an ivory and flint knife, called the Gebel el-Arak knife, would represent objects typically Mesopotamian. Thirdly, several constructions during the pre-dynastic were apparently inspired by contemporary Sumerian monuments. And finally, the emergence of Egyptian writing, which would be explained by an imitation of the Sumerian cuneiform. However, this theory has long since lost academic support. The main objection against it is that it's far too simple of a theory and fails to take into account the natural evolution of the pre-dynastic cultures. At no point did it seem that there ever was a break in this process. Furthermore, Egypt, and Mesopotamia for that matter, did not exist in a vacuum. There is much evidence against it, as the importation of objects outside the natural territory of Egypt was not uncommon. The Nile Valley was the destination of numerous outside objects, including wood, metal, obsidian, and produced objects, including those originating from Palestine and Mesopotamia. And by occasion, the exchange of ideas and techniques spread across the entire valley and beyond, as the desert, difficult to live as it may be, was not uninhabited. Due to its geographic position, Egypt was poised to take advantage of all innovations from both insider and outsider peoples. Its strong political organization, which derived from the conditions imposed by the fertile Nile Valley, put it in a position to tinker and improve upon the discovery of others, and to make numerous innovations. One can simply observe that by the late Pre-dynastic, as both the Scorpion Macehead and Narmer palette plainly demonstrate, Egypt possesses both a writing system and a solid political structure. The permanent unification of North and South marks the end of the prehistoric period and the very beginning of the history of Egypt. By the end of Narmer's reign, Egypt possesses its own language, fixed in a writing system which will not change, and a centralized monarchical organization. For the next few centuries, it will be governed by two dynasties originating from the south, the city of Thinis, nearby Abydos. Both dynasties have their administrative capital as Memphis, on the southern tip of the delta, from where they can govern the kings of both the south and the north, as its unity, precarious as it is still only realized by the sovereign ruler. Egyptian sources become more abundant, as literacy completes the information given to us by archaeology. The Palermo stone, the royal lists, and the Egyptian priest Manetho, who wrote much about Egyptian history, yet his works only survive through fragments from other authors, managed to preserve the names of the first and second dynasties by chronological order. The problem lies in finding the equivalency between those names and those provided through archaeological works. Each pharaoh had several names which constituted the official royal titles. For reasons which elude us, the name utilized by a pharaoh in his monuments isn't the same designated by those who have compiled a king list, leaving us with much uncertainty. The Abydos king list, Turin king list, as well as Manetho, all agree in giving the name of Menes to the first Egyptian pharaoh. But no contemporary document carrying this name exists. It is generally considered, through the palette discovered in Hierakonpolis, that Narmer was the first king to use the crowns of both the north and the south. Thus, we have two names for the same figure, Narmer in a contemporary monument, and Menes in posterior sources. Several explanations have been proposed to explain this dissonance. To some, Narmer and Menes would be two different names of the same person. To others, Narmer would be the predecessor to Menes, this one also being known as Hor-Aha. Third possibility, Narmer would be in fact Menes, and would have taken the name of Hor-Aha after his victory over the north. The three names would apply then to one and only historical figure. If the Scorpion King also used the double crown, all theories could be put into question, and he too would have as much right to be Menes as Narmer. The one difficulty is, would that be the case, we would have then 9 sovereign rulers of the first dynasty, while Manetho only gives us 8. Finally, it is questionable that Menes may have existed at all. His name in written sources would come from the reading of hieroglyphics that mean somebody. In other words, X. The transcribers of the oldest sources would have then ignored what was the name of the first pharaoh of Egypt. As one can see, the problem of the name of the first Egyptian pharaoh is extremely complex and can't be absolutely resolved, though, all things considered, identifying Menes as Narmer appears to be the more plausible hypothesis. It is certainly the most common among Egyptologists. Manetho labels the first two dynasties as Thinite. Royal tombs have been discovered in a large necropolis in Abydos, nearby Tinis. But there were also discovered large tombs of the same time frame in Saqqara, nearby Memphis. Egyptian custom was to always bury its rulers nearby their place of residency. Thus, the dilemma: if the royal necropolis was in Abydos, what were then the large tombs in Saqqara? If these tombs are in fact a royal necropolis, the capital should be Memphis. In this case, why the royal tombs in Abydos? It is supposed then that the pharaoh, being king of both Upper and Lower Egypt, would have two separate tombs, one as king of the north, the other as king of the south. One of the tombs should then be completely ceremonial and devoid of a body, a cenotaph. Seeing as in both Saqqara and Abydos the tombs were looted, it's difficult to solve the dilemma and to determine which is the true tomb and which is the cenotaph. Just like the matter of the identity of Menes, there is no clear solution, and discussion remains open. Due to the monuments discovered in both Saqqara as well as Abydos, the order of succession of the kings of the first dynasty could be established. Such documents mostly consist in small ivory or ebony tablets, which denote the most important event which occurred under the rulership of the king, whose name is marked. As such, the first dynasty is established, with its rulers being Narmer, Hor-Aha, Jer, Chet, Ten, Anejib, Semerchet, and Kaha. Narmer, if he is in fact Menes, would have founded Memphis. However, with the exception of some objects discovered in Abydos, the monuments which make him known all come from Hierakonpolis. Hor-Aha, sometimes simply called Aha, is known through numerous monuments which make allusions to military victories over the Nubians, the Libyans, and perhaps over the northern Egyptians. The unification of the country, then, would still be in a precarious state under his reign. The same sources mention religious festivals and the foundation of a temple in Sais to the Egyptian goddess of war, Neith. The following pharaoh is Jer. To his reign is attributed some sort of military campaign, as one of his regnal years on the Cairo stone was named Year of Smithing the Land of Sejet, which is speculated to have been the Sinai or beyond in Asia. Also in his reign, it is possible Jer may have conquered Nubia up until the Second Cataract, as an inscription of his name was found nearby at Wadi Halfa. However, the authenticity of this inscription is questionable. The crown is then passed to Jet. Just as his successor, he too campaigned outside of Egypt, as his name was found on the road which leads to the Red Sea. Vessel fragments and seal impressions demonstrate that there were intense trading relations with Syria and Canaan during his reign. One of his artistically refined tomb steles is today on display in the Museum of the Louvre. Succeeding him comes Den, known through the objects found in his tomb in Abydos. One of these represents him conducting a rite of the Set festival. Just as his predecessors, Den participated in military campaigns. The MacGregor plaque displays Den holding a mace in one hand and an enemy's hair in the other, with the hieroglyphs at the side saying, "First Smithing of the East." While Manetho credits his reign as lasting for 20 years, historians generally believe his reign lasted for much longer. Based on inscriptions from the Palermo stone, his reign is nowadays considered to have lasted for an incredible 42 years. As far as early dynastic rulers go, Den is most likely the best archaeologically attested ruler of this period, and much of his reign compared to other pharaohs of this time is far better understood. The reign of Den appears to have been a period of prosperity for Egypt and for the dynasty itself. But the door of history begins closing on the first dynasty of Egypt upon his death. His successor, Anejib, which Manetho named Miebidos, was credited by the Tyrian king list with an implausible 74 years of rule, while Manetho attributes him with only 26. But modern historians consider both records to be exaggerations and generally credit Anejib with a reign lasting between 8 and 10 years, and his reign is associated with calamity. His successor, Sermechet, appears to have also endured through a turbulent reign, as Manetho reported some sort of calamity occurred during his rule. His reign, too, only lasted for about 8 years, before being succeeded by the last pharaoh of the first dynasty, Ka, who did appear to have a long and fairly tranquil reign, as he lasted for 33 years in power. His death likely resulted in a struggle between differing factions for the empty throne, and eventually, a new king emerged, a man named Hotepsechemui, the first pharaoh of the second dynasty of Egypt. From the second dynasty onwards, there is no doubt that the administrative capital of Egypt is Memphis. The simple fact that, from now on, there are no longer royal tombs in Abydos would be enough to justify the change of dynasty, as Manetho denotes, as he attributes a total of 9 pharaohs, which have been later identified as such: Hotepsechemui, Nebra, Ninecher, Weneg, Senej, Neferkara I, Neferkasokar, Hujefa, and Hasechemui. As previously said, Hotepsechemui is the first king of the dynasty. His name, meaning he who reconciles the two powers, hints to a turbulence between the north and the south, which he ended. Unfortunately, starting from his reign, the plaques utilized by the previous dynasty are substituted by cylinders, which give us information about the kingdom's administrative organization, but say nothing about political events. Manetho attributes Hotepsechemui a reign of 38 years, though, as usual, modern historians see this period as an exaggeration, and generally shave off at least 10 years from this designated period. His successor, Nebra, is also given a similarly sized reign, one of 39 years, and modern historians tend to credit him a reign spanning 10 to 14 years. Manetho adds that under his reign, the Apis bulls in Memphis, the bull god Mnevis in Heliopolis, and the ram god Banebjedet were worshipped. In truth, these cults were already established by the time of the first dynasty. The next king was Nineter, who had a truly large reign. Manetho gives him a reign of 47 years, while the Turin canon gives him an impossibly large reign of 96. Egyptologists credit his reign, however, as one which lasted either 43 or 45 years. The following successors aren't well known, to the point we can't even accurately give them their names. Surviving sources may be in fact giving different types of names to the same rulers. They may be also entirely different individuals, or could be legendary names. Alternatively, the kingdom may have split upon Nineter's death, and was ruled by 2 different kings due to the complex nature of Egypt's state administration. It is only through the last ruler, Hasechemui, that order appears to have been re-established. At first glance, one may believe it is unclear if Hasechemui should really be considered to be part of the second dynasty of Egypt, as it isn't wholly clear that he was even related to the other rulers of this dynasty. And yet, at the same time, we do know he is almost certainly the father of the following ruler, the first king of the third dynasty, Djoser. From our modern eyes, one may wonder if it isn't more accurate to say the third dynasty begins with him rather than his son. However, the first pharaoh of a new dynasty being the son of the last pharaoh of the previous isn't uncommon, and, as we'll see later on, this is not the only time this happened. Typically, a new dynasty emerges when the new pharaoh isn't the child of the primary wife of the ruling pharaoh. The same thing will happen as we transition from the third dynasty to the fourth. Of course, when discussing the Egyptian dynasties, it should be noted that they are a convention stemming from ancient sources, such as Manetho or the Turin King List. For an example, the 7th dynasty almost certainly didn't exist, but we still call it as such. Regardless, with the death of Khasehemui, the Thinite period comes to an end. If it's true that the essential traits of Egyptian civilization are acquired since the end of the Pre-dynastic, it's the Thinite period which adds precision to them. The unity of the country, sketched in the Pre-dynastic, was consolidating. With that goal in mind, the Thinite pharaohs seem to have used two means. On one hand, strength to suppress rebellions, and on the other, a policy of alliances, which may be hinted through the names of the queens, which, in the first dynasty, are formed with the name of the goddess Neith, chief goddess of Sais in northern Egypt. This policy was accompanied by an activity which could qualify as diplomatic. Hor-Aha built, or rebuilt, the Temple of Neith, and Djer visits its sanctuary. The installation of the central administration in Memphis, at the center of Lower Egypt, would obey to its nearby presence, and perhaps conciliate with its conquerors. This policy of marrying with families from the north may have continued with the second dynasty, as the name of the last queen of the Thinite period, Nimathap, contains the name of the deity of Apis, extremely popular in Memphis. Taking advantage of internal peace, the Thinite monarchy focuses on its external enemies, displayed by its numerous military campaigns both inside and outside of Egypt. Djer may have penetrated Nubia as far as the second cataract of the Nile, though this is dubious, and certainly campaigns against peoples from the east, and then defeats the desert nomads. With perhaps the exception of Nubia, the military policy of the first two dynasties appears to have been mostly defensive. It discourages Bedouin desires, and perhaps punished the Libyans for having joined the north in a rebellion. The relations with the exterior are not necessarily bellicose. Starting from the Pre-dynastic, the Nile Valley encourages trading relations with its neighbors, especially Palestine, and in the Thinite period, the trading with that region intensifies. Jewelers and vase cutters utilize stones from very far away. Wood is imported from the Palestinian coast. The discovery of Palestinian pottery in Egypt and Egyptian vases in Byblos confirms the relations between Egypt and Canaan. Finally, ivory, ebony, and perhaps obsidian made their way into the Nile Valley through the distant south. The Thinite period leads to an establishment of a centralized monarchy supported by a consistently improving administration. The unity of Egypt depends on the king. Its servants depend directly upon him. Among the most important being the Ajmer, which will turn into the provincial governor, the nomarch. It isn't certain, though it may be possible, that there was already a vizier. The chancellor is in charge of the census, which is verified every 2 years, which counted not people, but livestock. The Thinite administration, aided by the development of writing, seems to have been effective. New cities are founded, farmland created, and land conquered from both the desert and the swamp. The administrative capital plants itself in Memphis and stays there for centuries. The monarchy organizes itself. Through lavish ceremonies and festivals, its representative gains a godly power. The Set festival, connected to royal power, is taking place at an increasing frequency. A court is created around the king, with all his titles and ceremonial splendor. The pharaoh, representative and descendant of the god Horus, is considered divine himself. The techniques transmitted by the pre-dynastic cultures improved. It is the great epoch of stone cutting. Its sculptures create the first works of Egyptian art, such as the Star of the Scorpion King or the statue of Khasehemui. They know how to make copper statues. Jewelers create admirable jewels. This improvement extends to architecture. The tombs are larger and more complex. There's still little information over the religion practiced, but we do know that at this point, the gods associated to ancient Egypt were already being worshipped, and that considerable temples of such divinities were built by the Thinite kings. This includes Horus, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Min, Anubis, Nath, and Sakaris. The cult of the animals already plays an important role. At around 2700 BCE, the Old Kingdom begins with a third dynasty, and it will last for around 500 years. This unified Egypt, from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean, is a monarchy of divine right. Its agricultural territory is defined, its religion is fixed, and its writing, techniques, and arts have been definitively acquired. The Egyptian civilization, at this point, possesses all its notable characteristics, which will remain largely unchanged until its conquest by the Macedonian king Alexander in 332 BCE. It was the German Egyptologist Baron von Bunsen who first coined the Old Kingdom as one of its three golden ages, all the way back in 1845. However, in practice, the Old Kingdom is little more than a continuation of the Thinite period. The history of this dynasty has many uncertainties. It isn't possible to firmly establish neither the number nor the succession order of the kings. It was even debated for a time who was really the first king of this dynasty. Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson postulated that the founder of this dynasty was Sanacht, perhaps the brother of Djoser. But most Egyptologists believe the founder of this dynasty was in fact the latter. The son of Khasehemui and Nimatap, this pharaoh had a strong claim to the two Egyptian crowns. Sanacht may have been a successor, as the two were not very far apart temporarily. In contemporary inscriptions, Djoser is called by his Horus name, Netcherichet, meaning divine of body, and it was through later writings and inscriptions which allowed us to confirm both Netcherichet and Djoser are in fact two different names given to the same person. It was under the reign of Djoser in which the very first Egyptian pyramid was built. Situated in the Saqqara necropolis, this construction is the work of perhaps the most famous Egyptian historical figure to never wear the crown in all of ancient history, the royal chancellor Imhotep, who also worked as an architect, high priest, perhaps physician and servant of King Djoser. The Greeks identified him with their own god of medicine, Asclepius, and worshipped him much like their own, as a deified mortal who rose through divinity through medicine practices. However, there is no actual evidence that Imhotep was truly a physician. With its 6 steps, the Pyramid of Djoser stands at 62.5 meters, 205 feet in imperial units, with a base of 121 meters by 109 meters. In other words, 397 feet by 358 feet. The pyramid itself was in truth a part of a larger mortuary complex. It is supposed that the funerary temple that was built alongside the pyramid was in fact a replica of the royal palace. The pyramid itself was a result of various modifications. Initially, it was a simple mastaba, that is, a parallelepiped of the same type as the tombs of the kings of the first two dynasties. The labyrinth of corridors underground carry 11 funerary chambers, supposedly destined to Djoser's family. North from the pyramid, in the temple destined to the funerary cult, a life-size statue of the king was discovered. At the south of the pyramid stands a large courtyard surrounded by chapels at its south and east. East of the pyramid are two pavilions, one further south, one further north, appearing to symbolize the two kingdoms. Other smaller edifices would perhaps be sanctuary for the gods of the various nomes. The other courtyard and edifices would be destined to the said festival celebration. The discovery of an unfinished pyramid in 1951 gave us the name of Djoser's successor, Sechemchet. This man would have presumably reigned for only 6 years, hence the unfinished pyramid. This discovery allowed us, by comparison, to attribute yet another unfinished pyramid to the Third Dynasty, the Pyramid of Zawiet el-Aryan. The only name attributed to the pharaoh of such pyramid is Khaba, the Horus name. The last king of the Third Dynasty, Huni, known through a granite cone found in Elephantine, was for a long time believed to have begun the construction of the Pyramid of Meidum, a construction that would be finished by Sneferu, the first king of the Fourth Dynasty. However, this theory has been called into question, and many believe that this pyramid was built by Sneferu as a cenotaph. In total, there are only 5 confirmed kings of the Third Dynasty, but Manetho writes there were 9. 3 names, 2 belonging to confirmed kings and 1 belonging to a speculated king, were discovered in the archaeological site of Wadi Magareh in the Sinai Peninsula, namely Djoser, Sechemchet, and Sennacht. In other words, the Third Dynasty mounted expeditions into the territory, possibly the first ones, likely to extract turquoise from its mines. It's assumed Huni fortified Elephantine, and, on the basis of a Ptolemaic document, that Djoser would have annexed all of Lower Nubia into Egypt, questionable as that information may be. Military expeditions aside, the lasting legacy of the Third Dynasty is the Pyramid of Djoser built in Saqqara. The monument attests the importance of the religious rites created around the king. Egyptian art, however, has not yet fully sprouted, though it will under the following dynasty. Ever since antiquity, the fame of the Great Pyramids allowed them to be considered one of the 7 wonders of the world, and yet their founders were barely known. The number, as well as the order of the ruling pharaohs, isn't fully established as far as the Fourth Dynasty goes. Manetho gives us a total of 8 kings, but the Tyrian papyrus only gives us 6. One Roman historian, Eusebius, gives us a grand total of 17 kings, but he is generally disregarded by most Egyptologists. Generally, there are 6, potentially 8, pharaohs we know of. The 6 being Sneferu, Khufu, Djedefre, Khafre, Menkaure, and Shepseskaf. Generally, it's considered that this dynasty lasted somewhere between 100 and 200 years. The change in the dynasty, according to Manetho, does not mean there had been a rupture in lineage from one to the other. In fact, Sneferu was certainly the son of Huni, born of a secondary wife. He confirmed his rights to the crown via marrying his half-sister, she too an offspring of Huni. Thanks to the Palermo stone, Sneferu's reign is remarkably well known. Once, Sneferu returned from an expedition to Nubia with 7,000 prisoners and 20,000 head of cattle. Following shortly, he defeated the Libyans, this time capturing 11,000 men and 13,000 head of cattle. Furthermore, he made numerous incursions to the Sinai. The Palermo stone also mentions multiple constructions of temples, fortresses, and palaces throughout Egypt, this being one of the reasons he sent maritime expeditions into what is today Lebanon to bring in construction wood. However, what Sneferu is most likely famous for is the pyramids, as 3 of the pyramids he had ordered to be constructed have survived to this very day. Though the pyramid that made them was long thought to have been initiated by Huni and finished by Sneferu, it's now generally believed the monument is entirely the latter's work. The 2 other pyramids which have survived are the Bent and the Red Pyramid. The first of these, the Bent Pyramid, is given this name because the top section was built at a shallower angle of 43 degrees, compared to the lower section which rises at an inclination of 54. But it was with the Red Pyramid that we have the first true smooth-sided pyramid. It is through Sneferu that the royal tomb gains its definitive form to all the Old Kingdom. In truth, the pyramid was only a part of the tomb, a smaller part of the cult of the dead king. It starts with a funerary boat reaching a building, the Temple of the Valley. The king's sarcophagus would then be carried through a paved way to the funerary temple in front of the east side of the pyramid. The Temple of the Valley, the paved way, the funerary temple, and the pyramid itself. From Sneferu onwards, all pyramids built in the future will carry all these 4 elements, with the only variations being the decorum and size. The successor of Sneferu was Khufu. The son of Sneferu and grandson of Huni, little is known about the events which happened during his reign. However, it was under his rule in which the largest monument of the Bronze Age was built, the Great Pyramid of Giza. When it was built, it reached an impressive height of 144 meters, or 481 feet. Its base occupies more than 5 hectares of land. It isn't merely a marvel from its sheer size. It is also a mathematical marvel, as many of the casing stones and inner chamber blocks fit together with an extremely high degree of precision. Their joints were on average 5 millimeters wide, that is, 0.02 inches, and the accuracy of the perimeter is only off by 58 millimeters. At the same time, Khufu also ordered the restoration and construction of several temples. It is assumed, due to all the architectural work, the royal administration worked very effectively under him, and that his reign was economically prosperous. Succeeding Khufu was Djedefre. His reign is poorly known. Manetho attributes him a reign of 63 years, but this is certainly an exaggeration. Most Egyptologists seem to agree the length of his reign was on the shorter side. The pyramid he had constructed for himself is no more, but it was built at Abu Rawash, some 8 kilometers, or 5 miles, north from Giza. The successor of Djedefre was his brother Khafre. The pyramid he had constructed is immediately recognizable upon looking at the Great Pyramids, for at first glance it appears to be the tallest. However, this is only because it was built at a slightly higher altitude. The funerary complex, which accompanies the monument, is at a better state than the Pyramid of Khufu. It is there, at the Temple of the Valley, that one finds a statue of Khafre. And of course, due to its proximity, an enormous limestone statue of a sphinx, which will become almost as celebrated as the pyramids themselves. In fact, During the period of the New Kingdom, the Great Sphinx became deified. The succession of Khafre remains imprecise. A lacuna of the Turin list between Khafre and Menkaure leaves enough space for a name between the two kings. The name of this unknown pharaoh might have been Bofre, but there's little information. The next confirmed king was Menkaure, son of Khafre. His pyramid is the last of the three great pyramids of the Giza complex. Very little, too, is known about his reign. According to Herodotus, he seemed to have been a well-intentioned king who suffered a harsh degree of familial misfortune. As the historian claims, he alleviated the suffering of the Egyptian people following his father's reign, and that his daughter died before he did. The successor of Menkaure is his son Shepseskaf. It is with his reign that the fourth dynasty begins to decline. At the time his father Menkaure died, his pyramid was unfinished, and his son would have to complete the work not with stone, but brick. For himself, he renounces on building a pyramid, having to be content with merely an enormous sarcophagus. The tomb is of notable quality, but a clear step down from the enormous pyramids. His reign was almost certainly short, not more than 7 years. The dynasty extinguishes itself from the record. Manetho adds a total of 4 kings after Menkaure, but with the exception of Shepseskaf, no monuments have remained. The events which have occurred throughout the 4th dynasty are not very well known. They might have occupied Nubia, but vestiges of such are questionable. What the 4th dynasty pharaohs certainly concerned themselves with was Asia, which provided Egypt the wood necessary for the dynasty's great constructions. The Khufu ship, for an example, was mostly made with Lebanon cedar. The deserts at east and west, as well as the Sinai Peninsula, were frequently visited by expeditions which procured metals. And as far as the Libyans go, one may believe that after the campaigns of Sneferu, the following pharaohs learned how to contain them, if not outright rule them. The 4th dynasty also carries a development and improvement of the royal administration, as well as great artistic progress. Private monuments often appear beside the royal monuments, such as statues of princes, princesses, and high servants, and paintings of these people in tombs. For the most part, they are limited to the funerary rites, but scenes from private life begin making themselves known. The lesser arts show a degree of technique which will be sometimes of equal quality but never surpassed again. Numerous problems subsist in the order of succession, number of pharaohs, and in the duration of the reigns of the 4th dynasty. Luckily, we have a much clearer picture of the 5th, be it the order of succession, number of kings, and how long it lasted. Manetho assigns 248 years to the 5th dynasty, but the real number was more likely to be around 150 years. The rulers, by their throne name, are as follows: Userkaf, Sahure, Neferirkare, Neferefre, Shepseskare, Niusere, Menkauhor, Jetkare, and Unas. In total, 9 kings. The first king of the dynasty, Userkaf, appears to be descended from the 4th, likely belonging to a branch of the family. Thus, it seems as if there wasn't a total rupture between the 2 dynasties. However, a popular tale, coming to us via the Westcar Papyrus, gives us a completely different version of the arrival of the 5th dynasty. A woman named Redetjet gives birth to 3 sons, all meant to be great leaders in their own right, according to the wishes of the god Ra. The legend, at least, underlines the importance that the cult of Ra acquires during this dynasty. It is in fact with it that the title Son of Ra regularly takes place among the royal epitaphs. The Palermo stone further shows us the numerous pious constructions of the dynasty. The pyramid of Userkaf lies in Saqqara, nearby Djozers. However, this monument, now ruined, was not comparable in the slightest with the pyramids of the previous dynasty, being much smaller in comparison. In fact, this will be the case for the pyramids constructed throughout the 5th dynasty, which may explain why these works didn't resist the gradual wear of time and present themselves today as a pile of rubble. However, if on one hand Userkaf and his successors are content with more simple funerary monuments, all of them also built temples to the god Ra. It isn't exactly clear why each will order the construction of a personal temple to the sun god, though this tendency will end even before the dynasty finishes. While Manetho ascribes Userkaf a reign of 28 years, the Turin list, much more reliable to scholars, gives him a reign of 7 years. It is also around this time that the great provincial families begin consolidating power in Egypt. Succeeding Userkaf is Sahure, who reigned around 13 years. It was him who inaugurated the necropolis of Abusid, which belongs to the dynasty. Its walls provide us with several details regarding these reigns. Sahure campaigned against the Libyans and the Bedouins of the northeast. He was also in contact with the Syrio-Palestinian coast, as the depictions of bearded foreigners show us. The Palermo stone also informs us that he made an expedition to the faraway region of Punt in the Horn of Africa. Neferkirare succeeded Sahure. Once thought to be his predecessor's brother, he is now identified as being his son. He reigned for around 17 years. We also possess archives in papyrus, which refer to the administration of his funerary temple. The following pharaohs are Neferefre and Shepseskare. Very little is known about each ruler, as both kings had very short reigns. Their successor Niosere is a little more well known, in large part thanks to his funerary complex. He ruled for over 30 years and sent expeditions outside his reign, namely the Sinai. The 7th king of the dynasty, Menkaure, reigned for about 8 years, and very little has survived from his reign. His successor Djedkare, however, had a very long reign. A contemporary text mentions the 20th livestock census of his reign, and seeing as such census was done every 2 years, that means Djedkare reigned for at least 39 years. The Sinai contain vestiges of expeditions made during his reign. The last king of the dynasty, Unas, also seems to have had a long reign, 30 years in fact. He was the first pharaoh who ordered to write texts in the interior of his pyramid. These texts give us information regarding religion, particularly about the funerary cult. The 5th dynasty ends here. It's certainly less rich in royal monuments than the previous dynasty. However, under its rule, the private earns the habit of decorating its tombs, or mastabas, with scenes inspired from everyday life. It's there one finds an incredible source of knowledge regarding Egyptian civilization. The wealth of these tombs also show us that royal power is beginning to fade away. Under Khufu, there was no possible private comparison to his enormous pyramid and the modest tombs of the servants which surrounded his funerary complex. But with Unas, the royal tomb loses its importance as private tombs gain theirs, and in such a way that the only major difference lies in its shape: a pyramid for the pharaoh, a mastaba for the private. This weakening of royal power will become more noticeable under the following dynasty. However, before then, we'll stop for a moment and see how Egyptian civilization developed under the Old Kingdom. Its domain, extensive as it is, makes it one of the most powerful states of pre-classical antiquity. Its art makes it one of the more developed civilizations at the time. Egypt could not prosper if the works demanded to take advantage of the Nile floods wouldn't be made on time for the entire country. The execution of these works makes a rigorous administration necessary. Under the Old Kingdom, the chief responsible for these works continues to be the provincial chief, as it was during the Thinite period, a work dependent on the royal authority. He is, as well, the one who enforces the pharaoh's justice in every 2 years the census for his province. Inside his domain, he possesses the power which the monarch commands throughout the whole country. Only the list of titles displayed in the public servant tombs have some information regarding the administration of the Old Kingdom. Such titles have a pretty unequal value. Some appear to be entirely honorific, such as Unique Companion or Known to the King, surviving from the Archaic period. Others, such as Chiefs of Secrets of Things Only One Man Sees, or Chief of the King's Secrets Everywhere, being titles attributed to appease the posthumous ego of the deceased. The titles connected to the pharaoh's personal service are, without a doubt, more meaningful. The same applies with titles related to the function of royal power in the court. It's the case for the chief responsible for the royal wardrobe, or physician of the king, and further extends to those responsible for weaving, metallurgy, or carpentry. The list mentions numerous priests connected to both the divine cult as well as the funerary cult of the pharaoh. Among the administrative departments, the treasury is one of the most important. It initially included a White House and a Red House. In the Old Kingdom, it's unified under the name of Double White House. It receives taxation in goods, which are then deposited in the double granary. This double granary is administered by a chief. Each nome possesses the indispensable organism necessary to pay the administrative staff of the province, as well as the organization of public works for the general interest, such as constructing dikes and maintaining canals. In truth, ancient Egypt only came to know currency at the very end of its history. The service was instead paid in goods. High public servants would receive income from the domains related to their work, while lesser public servants received all different types of goods as salary. All authority comes from the king, who is lord of all administration. If one reads his qualifications next to his name by the letter, he is very much a god on earth, son of Ra, descendant of Horus, the good god, of which the very universal order is dependent upon. The shield surrounding the king's name is perhaps related to the sun. Much like the celestial object, the pharaoh is thus, in theory, lord of the universe, or at least as much of the universe as people comprehended it back then. The truth itself is, evidently, much more modest. However, the king is not truly a god, not in the sense we give that word. Popular belief dictated the god Ra had laid with a woman in order to procreate the kings of the 5th dynasty. Royal power is, by extension, truly one of divine origin, where the importance of bloodline in the transmission of power is highlighted. Under the Old Kingdom, the first sovereign ruler of a dynasty is typically from a branch of the preceding one. Most of the time, he reinforces his authority by marrying a half-sister from the previously ruling family branch. Monarch of divine right, the king has all the power: administrative, judicial, military, and religious. By principle, he is the only being on earth who can properly represent the gods. But since it is impossible to exercise all these powers entirely by himself, he must rely on his collaborators. In the Archaic period, and still under the 3rd dynasty, it is the Chancellor of Lower Egypt, the one responsible for the central administration. Under the 4th dynasty onwards, it is the vizier who occupies the highest office, while at the same time, the title of Chancellor of Lower Egypt stops being used and it is replaced by the title Chancellor of God. In this case, the god being the reigning pharaoh. It's these chancellors who will often lead expeditions outside of Egypt. The vizier is the true alter ego of the king, the one who receives all his kingly powers. It's perhaps for this reason why, most times, seems to be chosen among members of the royal dynasty, though, starting from the 5th dynasty, non-royals began occupying this role. Among the many attributed powers to the vizier, the most important is without a doubt justice. He is given the title of Priest of Maat, Goddess of Truth, Justice, and Universal Order. Of course, the vizier handles all administration, the treasury, the arsenal, agricultural works or public works, as well as the services for the courts. In order for the vizier to effectively administrate the country, he had to know with immense precision the amount of reserves each province could deliver. Thus, the necessity of a considerable administrative correspondence. And so, one of the most essential jobs of the vizier is the registry and guard of the archives, where the assignment of taxation per each province, the property holders, royal decrees, contracts, and all else which allows him to control the income of the treasury. This administration, highly complex, is reliant in reality on the scribe. It's him who, at a provincial scale, writes down the list of all that is needed, gathers all documentation which serves as a base of knowledge for the central administration. At the very least since the 1st dynasty, the Egyptian scribe possesses an incomparable instrument for his work, the papyrus. This material allows the scribes to operate all necessary administrative operations with much ease. Lists of people and material, registering acts, obituaries, births, and, above all, official correspondence. The only flaw of the papyrus, regardless of the time and care needed for its production, is its fragility. There are countless administrative and literary documents which were destroyed over time. From this point of view, Egyptian civilization is at great disadvantage compared to Mesopotamia, as documents made of clay are far less vulnerable compared to those made of papyrus. The importance of the scribe in everyday life is underlined by the multiple interpretations of the character which Old Kingdom art has left us. He is, in fact, the key to the entire administration. Later, in every city, it would seem scribes were specifically educated for such lives under a somewhat archaic version of a school. But it's not known if the Old Kingdom already had such an institution. The scribes were likely recruited from the sons of public servants. However, in ancient Egypt, there is no caste system. Nothing theoretically prevents the son of a farmer from becoming a scribe. The army, commanded in theory by the king, doesn't seem to have had a permanent organization in the Old Kingdom. In cases of necessity, the provinces would provide with recruits of a certain age. The chiefs ordered to command them were then designated by the pharaoh and, at that time, would assume a military title. Agriculture constitutes the essential resource of Egypt, but the argument over the proprietor of the soil has remained. For a long time, it was considered that the king was, juridically, the sole proprietor of the soil. However, in certain contracts, the land will be put under the permanent dependence of a private proprietor. It is the case, as an example, of the constitution of the funeral arrangements in favor of some more privileged in wealth. There are wills that show property can be split equally among the children of the deceased. This demonstrates, seemingly, that property, or at least a right to exploitation of the soil, does not belong solely to the pharaoh. At the same time, there is unquestionable royal property next to land which we would classify as private. These lands are controlled by special service workers and seem to be mostly gained from the desert or the swamp, due to improvements in regards to irrigation. It's these lands which the king taxes in order to cover the donations to temples or privates for the constitution of food and funerary funds. The flood of the Nile enriches agricultural life. It is the source of all wealth in Egypt. In September, starting from the moment the water recedes, the farmer plants the seed on the often wet soil. Some animals left in the field will bury the seed by stepping on the soil. Only when the land begins to harden will the farmer begin relying on tools to plant more seeds. The creation of livestock and fishing still play an important role in the Egyptian economy. Up until the 2400 BCE or so, the Nile Valley isn't entirely surrounded by desert as it is today, but by steppe. Egyptians had been long attempting to domesticate wildlife, even during the pre-dynastic and archaic periods. These attempts continue in the Old Kingdom. Antelope, most notably the oryx, are still raised for slaughter, and the hyena is tried as a hunting companion. The mastabas of the Old Kingdom represent with frequency the occupier of the tomb hunting in the desert and fishing in the swamp. Hunting seems to have two purposes. On one hand, it complements diet and provides a testing ground for the domestication of different species, as the hunting companion must catch his prey still alive. On the other, hunting has religious purposes. The animals of the steppe and desert depend on the god Seth, brother but also assassin of Osiris. Therefore, they are malevolent and must be destroyed. The swamps provide a great amount of resources to the kingdom. Papyrus is indispensable to the scribe, but also to the fabric of crowns and cables, as well as light boats for fishing and hunting in aquatic areas, as fish constitutes one of the dietary bases. All sorts of means were utilized to capture them, be it nets, hooks, and a harpoon for the largest species. It was then prepared in the same place where it was captured. Opened up, it's left out to dry. It's in the swamps that the Egyptians captured numerous birds, via the use of very large nets. Egyptian property, be it royal, clerical, or private, constitutes an economic unit unto its own. It includes peasants, shepherds, hunters, fishers, and artisans and builders, who create whatever tools needed for the exploitation of whatever is produced in said property. All dominions were subject to fixed payments to the treasury. However, starting from the 5th dynasty, the king acquires the habit of conceding certain tax immunities to both temples as well as private individuals, and hand off certain royal property to privates, so they could organize his funerary cult, or to the temples to further feed the service of divine offerings. This practice impoverishes the resources of the state, and may be one of the causes for the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Though agriculture and creation of livestock were the foundations of the Egyptian economy, they do not give the civilization all indispensable products to it. Egypt lacks construction wood of good quality. Highly important, given all travel and transportation is made via the maritime path, through the river. The Nile Valley also does not possess much mining material. These are found at mountainous areas far away from the river. And, as economy develops, Egypt is forced to increasingly rely on metal. Thus, it was forced to procure for wood and copper via trade. The expeditions tasked with bringing these products were of the king's responsibility. They could be of extreme importance. Sneferu sends a fleet of 40 ships to the Palestinian coast. Sahure does not hesitate in sending ships to the Somalian coast to acquire incense. The Sinai Peninsula is visited with regularity. The Egyptians go there for turquoise and, perhaps, copper. The latter would also come from the eastern desert and Nubia. Gold is extracted in eastern mines nearby the Gebtu, modern-day Kift. It serves as a reference to the most important of transactions. Finally, the quarries of the desert, be it in the east, west, or the south, are exploited for the hard stone desired for construction works and vases. It does not seem as if, these great commercial expeditions from the state aside, there was a significant portion of the population devoted to trade. Services were paid through barter, and the general population is seemingly content with exchanging whatever they have available in order to obtain whatever goods they desire. On the top of the social hierarchy is the king and his family, which may be quite extensive, as the ruler, unlike his subjects, may have several legitimate spouses. Outside of the royal family, there doesn't seem to have been a true hereditary nobility. The court is constituted of the highest-ranking officials and by the king's personal servants, who lords over his men and the maintenance of this privileged class. However, the necessities of the funerary cult, which has to be permanent, would ensure that its necessary roles would become hereditary, in such a way that, by the end of the Old Kingdom, a ruling class is beginning to form. The scribes constitute the large mass of the public servants. They know how to read, write, and calculate, the only conditions demanded in order to fulfill their role in society. Any subject of the pharaoh may become a scribe, but most were recruited from the families of the public servants. In its upper echelon, to serve the pharaoh is a source of wealth, which allows these workers to acquire private property. It is, therefore, possible that a class of property holders may be in the process of forming. However, the Egyptian custom of partible inheritance does not favor, in practice, the constitution of large estates, even more so that the part seated under the purpose of assuring the funerary cult tends to transform the property into goods belonging to the dead. In the inferior echelons of society are the peasants and artisans. In large domains, work is highly specialized. The farmer concerns himself exclusively with agriculture. The shepherd watches over the livestock, and the fishers and hunters explore the desert, the steppe, and the swamp. The same occurs with the artisans, whatever their specific role is. The great works are executed as mandatory work, long thought to have been unpaid, but as of fairly recently, we do know those who worked the pyramids were paid in beer. Religion plays an extremely important role in Egyptian civilization. The funerary cult, in particular, is highly regarded. From the beginning of the Old Kingdom, it comes to a point where it is distinguished from the religion itself, even though both are directed towards the same divinities. While the religion itself is local, with each nome having their own major deity and secondary gods, the funerary cult is universal, as for all Egypt the gods of the dead, and the funerary rites are the same. With the notable exception of the solar temples of the 5th dynasty, most temples of the Old Kingdom have either fallen into ruin or were destroyed during the first intermediate period, and so it is difficult to study the provincial cults. Meanwhile, under the Old Kingdom, the great religious centers were filled with activity. It was then that the great mythological narratives were born, mainly those that explained the creation of the world. The great cities, such as Heliopolis, Hermopolis, and Memphis, had their own divine system, which explained the successive appearance of divine couples, which symbolized the great forces of nature. The names and the number of couples varied with each system. That is the religion elaborated by the clergy of the great temples. On the other hand, the people's religion, poorly known, seems to have been connected to the cult of the sacred animals, whose origins appear to have been in the Pre-dynastic. The great gods of the Old Kingdom are Horus, old celestial god worshipped everywhere, Aten-Ra in Heliopolis, Ptah in Memphis, Thoth in Hermopolis, and Min in Coptos. Osiris, god of the Delta, whose cult exists since the Archaic period, wins more and more importance. In fact, it even surpasses very old gods, such as Horus and Anubis. Among goddesses, there is Hathor, goddess of Dendera. Isis, originating from the Delta like Osiris, and from very early on, is considered to be his wife. Neith, goddess of Sais, Wajet, goddess of Buto, and finally Nekhbet, goddess of Nekheb, modern-day El-Kab. Ever since the Old Kingdom, that its theological class utilized syncretism. It is in that way that the priests of Heliopolis assimilate almost all provincial gods to their own, Ra. Equally, those of Memphis identified the great gods of the pantheon to Ptah. The funerary cult represents the most notable characteristic of the ancient Egyptian religious beliefs. It presents, at the same time, a subterranean aspect which existed for a very long time, as far back as the Neolithic, as those men, and those who followed them in the Pre-dynastic, believed that the dead would live on under the soil in which they were buried, surrounded by their weapons and provisions, as well as a stellar aspect, which manifested during the Pre-dynastic, when some elements of the population start believing that the soul, once separated from the body, would join the stars in the night sky, and finally a solar aspect, reserved to the king, who would spend eternity accompanying the sun god. By the end of the Old Kingdom, these three aspects were beginning to fuse under a single system, all contradictions aside. The dead lives in the underworld where Osiris reigns, but at the same time may accompany the sun in its daily and nightly path, or live in the celestial fields. However, one condition is essential so the dead may survive beyond the tomb. It is necessary a material support in which the soul may fuse with. The best host for the soul is one's own body, and thus mummification as a process begins, with the purpose of making the body eternal. However, despite all protection, the body may disappear, and so statues are built in order to substitute it. At the same time, the practices of cremation become more frequent. The primitive tombs with a simple oval moat are substituted by the funerary chambers, which become increasingly numerous since the end of the Pre-dynastic. These practices involve in complexity throughout the Tainite dynasties and the Old Kingdom, up until the pyramids. Next to the king, private people too possess their eternal residence, the mastabas. So that they may subsist in the afterlife, the dead need to be provisioned. These necessities may be assured by the piety of their offspring. So the Egyptians have a tendency to ask for the heritage of functions, so that the son may ensure the funerary cult of his father. Another way to provision the tomb is to grant a source of income through contract. The royalty from Memphis gradually impoverishes itself by distributing large domains, whose income goes to the maintenance of these tombs and their provisions. Under many aspects, one may consider Old Kingdom art as the greatest of all Egyptian civilization. Architecture makes a decisive step starting from the Third Dynasty, when it abandons the use of brick for the stone in regards to the construction of the great monuments. First, it is the limestone which is used in the smaller rocks, and then new resources are discovered, and limestone is rapidly accompanied by harder material, such as granite and basalt. As more and more pyramids are built, the amount of time to construct a new one becomes increasingly shorter. For each reign, a new funerary complex was initiated, and all the experience acquired from the construction of the previous one was a blessing. Hence, the fairly rapid construction of the pyramids from the reign of Djoser onwards. And to all architectural progresses comes the appearance of decoration. Sculptors and painters, just as capable as architects, work for both the private as well as the royal family. The funerary temple of Khafre contained just by itself 17 larger-than-life statues of the king. The royal offices procured the hardest stones for its works, so that the artist's skill may not be hindered. The statues of the private, smaller and containing softer material, equally testify the skill of the Old Kingdom's artists. Starting from the 4th dynasty and becoming more prominent during the 5th, the private tombs, the pyramids, and the walls of the solar temples are decorated with the most notable of reliefs. The reliefs and statues were painted in color. The lesser arts are, in comparison, not as well known, largely because many tombs have been pillaged, leaving very few objects behind. However, the discovery of the tomb of Hetepheres I, the possible mother of the pharaoh Khufu, indicates that jewelers and ebonists were just as skilled as the sculptors and painters. Certain texts, such as the instructions of Khamenei or the maxims of Ptahhotep, contain several sayings and proverbs from the Old Kingdom. In fact, these texts were attributed to those who compiled them, as Khamenei lived under the pharaoh Huni of the 3rd dynasty and Ptahhotep during the 5th. Both are sequences of texts containing practical advice to the country's youth in order to attain an honorful role. They're more advice to good education and manners than any moral precept. The obedience to the father and to your superior is recommended, in the same manner as the virtue of silence and good manners within society. They also highlight fidelity and benevolence to those of an inferior status compared to their own. During the 5th dynasty, the Old Kingdom was still in its heyday. However, certain tendencies, which took place during its rule, will go into full overdrive during the 6th, and, with the major help of a radical change to the weather, will drive the Old Kingdom towards collapse. It will only take either 4 or 5 kings, so Egypt may pass from a strong and stable regime into anarchy. As it happens with frequency, there isn't a noticeable change between the 5th dynasty and the 6th, as the servants of the pharaoh Unas transition from serving him to the first pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, Teti, and one of his wives, Iput, mother of the future pharaoh Pepe I, was undoubtedly the daughter of Unas. The change of dynasty may have been due to the fact Unas didn't have a direct male heir, and so the right to power transitioned from him through his eldest daughter to her husband, whether or not he had been fathered by his predecessor. In total, there were 6, perhaps 7 kings of the 6th dynasty, which lasted for about 150 years, maybe more, in which the reign of its 5th king, Pepe II, occupies at least a third of this period. The names of the kings are Teti, Userkare, Pepe I, Nemtiemsaf I, Pepe II, Nemtiemsaf II, and potentially Necherkare. Teti would have reigned for about 12 years. The Egyptian historian Manetho affirms he was assassinated by his own personal guard. His name has been found in vases located in Byblos, and it's possible he may have led an expedition into Nubia. One of the rare documents which have survived to this day is a decree containing tax exemptions to the Temple of Abydos. The following king, Userkare, had a very short reign. Very little has survived from his rule, and it's been speculated he may have had a degree of involvement in the assassination of the previous pharaoh. The following pharaoh, Pepe I, may have instituted an early version of damnatio memorae upon Userkare, far before the Romans even existed. Regardless, there simply isn't enough concrete evidence to know exactly what happened. Pepe I, on the other hand, ruled for at least 40 years, and most likely more, as his reign contained 25 cattle counts, which, assuming such census was still conducted every 2 years, would mean his reign lasted for at least 49. He resumed the active policies of his predecessors, sending expeditions to Asia and Nubia. He celebrated a Set festival. One essential piece of information regarding his reign was the fact he married 2 daughters of a provincial noble, a man named Kui, and at least one of them became the mother of the next pharaoh. These 2 marriages demonstrate the importance which the noble provincial families have gained and would continue to attain. Nemtiemsaf I, also commonly called Merendre, is the oldest son of the previous pharaoh and reigned for a short amount of time, little more than 10 years. He seems to have favored the nobility of the province, which his mother was a part of. He nominates Idi, a maternal cousin, as the governor of the 12th nome of Upper Egypt. It is the beginning of a lineage in which the tombs of the great local lords provide numerous documents for the history of the end of the Old Kingdom. Pepe II had the longest reign of the 6th dynasty, and perhaps the longest reign in the entire history of Egypt. Both Manetho and the Turin King list assert a reign of over 90 years. However, the highest attested number from contemporary documents is only 64. Ascending to the throne at the age of 6, his mother most likely ruled as regent until his seniority. Throughout his long reign, Pepe II had at least 4 consorts, but seems to have survived most of his children. An inscription on a tomb gives us a glimpse of Pepe II's personality as a child. Such inscription, which is on a tomb we call the Autobiography of Arhuf, a governor of Aswan near the first cataract of the Nile, details an episode where the governor captured a pygmy on an expedition into Nubia. When news reached the royal court in Memphis, the excited young king sent word back to the governor that he would be greatly rewarded if the pygmy were to be brought alive to the capital city, where he would likely serve as an entertainer. The last king of the 6th dynasty is Necherkare, who seems to have had a short reign. It is possible this pharaoh may have in fact been Nitocris, a rare female ruler of Egypt. But this is a legendary figure, and Necherkare was certainly a male ruler. Regardless, with the death of Pepe II begins a particularly obscure period of Egyptian history, in which royal power fragments and the local lords rise to power, called the First Intermediate Period. From the 3rd to the 5th dynasty, power was increasingly centralized. With the 6th, the process inverted itself and power gradually goes back to the provinces until the kingdom collapses into anarchy. This collapse was partly caused by the political evolution of Egypt. The practice of donations to temples and to the privates, which began under the 4th dynasty, becomes increasingly common as time wore on, to such a point where the almighty pharaoh becomes impoverished. To this, the great temples and, above all, the provincial families gain an immense degree of importance. It would seem as if it was the provincial nobility the primary beneficiary of royal generosity. In order to ensure a competent administration of the country, the king is forced to have a representative with enlarged powers in each nome. On the other hand, the Egyptians, profoundly religious, look to ensure the passing of their functions to the eldest son, which enables him to ensure the funerary cult of his father. This inheritance, which would already be inconvenient for lesser posts, becomes dangerous when conceded to the nomarchs, which possess almost all powers inside their own provinces, their own personal army, the public works, the control of the royal granary, the command of justice, and maybe even control over its temples and its domains. To avoid nomarchs from becoming too powerful, it would be necessary to change them frequently. However, By maintaining habitually the same post, which would then be inherited by their children, the kings of the 6th dynasty largely contributed to the loss of their royal authority. Royal power remained strong for some time during the 6th dynasty. The numerous temples and monuments left behind by Teti and Pepe I put them among the greatest of Egyptian pharaohs. It would seem that at first, the role of the provincial nobility was beneficial, but as the extremely long reign of Pepe II continues, royal power becomes increasingly weak. However, the gradual loss of royal power in comparison to the nomarchs was not the sole reason for the Old Kingdom's collapse. During Pepe II's reign, something is changing dramatically. The flooding of the Nile is too shallow, and every year, not enough food is produced to feed the Egyptian population. A drought ravages the two lands. But it was likely not an isolated event. The collapse of the Old Kingdom lines up with a severe climactic event called the 4.2 kilo-year event, in which a very noticeable degree of aridification around several parts of the world took place. During this time, the other great kingdom in the Middle East, the Akkadian Empire, also collapsed. It has been hypothesized that this massive climactic shift caused or either greatly contributed to the collapses of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the Akkadian Empire, and the Liangzhou culture in the lower Yangtze River in China. Along with these civilizations, this event may have also greatly impacted India, initiating the collapse of the Indus River Valley civilization and starting the migration of the Indo-Europeans into India. However, while evidence of drought occurring during this time period was easy to discover in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Europe, and the Americas, the case isn't the same for India. It's difficult to determine exactly what caused the profound geologic change, but geologists increasingly suspect that the phenomenon known as El Niño played a role. Research into Egyptian soil does indicate an increased aridity in Egypt, which would have caused a drought. This drought would have lasted several decades, and maybe even up to 100 years, but more likely somewhere between 30 and 50, which would still be devastating for any civilization at the time. And so, with all the information available to us, we can more or less piece together the different factors which led to the collapse of the Old Kingdom, even if, in some sense, we enter the realm of speculation. As royal power weakens, local power increases. For some time, while royal power remains strong, it is able to retain its control over the country via a savvy policy of marriages and alliances with some of its more powerful aristocratic families. However, Pepe II's reign fully exposes the weakness of the royalty. As the king gets older, he gradually outlives its likely successors. When the drought begins, the king is powerless to stop it. The state's crop reserves are eventually exhausted, and the country falls into famine. The king may have looked into the outside world in order to find a solution, but the famine is too happening outside of Egypt. As a result, international commerce, which Egypt was so reliant on, collapses, further weakening royal power. And finally, the old king dies, leaving no clear successor in his place. Whoever succeeded him likely had no real power to enforce his claim of legitimacy, and so the kingdom falls into a state of anarchy, in which the empowered local aristocracy are those who reign supreme in their own individual provinces. Under the 4th and 5th dynasties, everything was concentrated around the pharaoh, even life after death. The only important cemeteries are those surrounding the pyramid of the king. Under the 6th dynasty, the province gains as much importance as the capital. The administrative titles multiply, and many important government roles become hereditary. Coupled with a severe drought and the collapse of trade, the ruling class of Memphis no longer has the means to overcome the dynastic crisis caused by the death of Pepe II. The Old Kingdom is dead, and the first intermediate period begins. The first intermediate period would last for over 100 years. Though it's often regarded as the Egyptian Dark Age, it would not be the end of its civilization. Though in the arts, Egypt would never quite reach the same heights it did during the Old Kingdom, its civilization marched on, producing 2 more golden ages in the Middle and New Kingdoms. But that is for another time. Thank you for watching.